Hi, this is Mr. Chandler. We're looking at Standard 3.1. In 3.1, we're looking at how the United States really gets to the edge of the Civil War. We're going to talk about the events and issues that are dividing the country and leading to the war. We're going to talk about some of the compromises reached. We're going to talk about the balance of free and slave states, the abolition movement, the Dred Scott case, and then the conflicting views on states' rights and federal power, which really is something we've discussed since the time of Hamilton and Jefferson, and even before that, the Constitutional Convention. We'll talk about the emergence of the Republican Party, the election of Lincoln, and then after the election of Lincoln is the succession of the South and the starting of the Confederate States of America. So what we've been discussing in Standard 2 was democracy expanding in the United States. More people are getting the right to vote as we move out, as we move westward, and more people are entering the Union as full partners under the Northwest Ordinance. The expansion is going to lead to the biggest challenge to democracy, and that's going to be that Southern elites are increasingly determined to maintain slavery. And if you think about it, it's important to them because as we add new states to the Union, that's going to mean more representatives in Congress from either free states or slave states. So if you add more free states, then all of a sudden they're going to have more power in Congress in the House of Representatives and the Senate, and that's going to lead to issues where the South's going to be worried that the North is going to pass issues that they don't particularly like for instance tariffs, like we've discussed before, or even more extreme case, they could get rid of slavery. And so that's what they're going to be really worried about that. So the South's going to really work hard to maintain the balance and to try to add more slave states so they don't feel like they're being overrun. Because at this point, the North is starting to have an advantage in the House of Representatives and in the Senate. It had been kept even for a long time, the number of slave states and free states. The Missouri Compromise is one example that we've already discussed in class, where Missouri was added as a slave state and Maine was added as a free state, so we kept the number equal. After that, they're going to draw a line at the 3630 line, and they're going to say that slavery is allowed below that line, but it's going to be free above that line. And as I said before in class, that's not going to solve the problem. In fact, if you look here on the map, Kansas and Nebraska are right over here in this area. Well, there's going to be a debate over whether Kansas and Nebraska should be slave states or free states. And so we'll talk about that in just a minute. Some other issues that are going on at the time is that Texas is annexed. That means we take Texas and make it part of the United States. It had been delayed for over a decade because it would have added a large slave state, so North wasn't excited about adding a large slave state to the country, and it would have upset the balance of power between slave and free states that had been solved by the Missouri Compromise. Eventually, Texas is going to be added as we start expanding and we start the Mexican War. Another big issue that comes up a little bit after this is the Wilmot Proviso. Representative Wilmot is from Pennsylvania, and he basically says that any territory that we get from Mexico should be free soil and not open to slavery. What free soil means is that that territory is going to be non-slave. That doesn't mean that Wilmot's an abolitionist. What it means is that all that territory is going to be free, not have slavery. And so that's a big designation to make, what free soil is compared to abolition. Southerners see the Wilmot Proviso as a threat, and they see it like they need to protect the balance of free states and slave states in the Senate so they can protect slavery, because they're worried that if all that territory we added from the Mexican War, like California, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, Utah, all that territory, if that's added as free soil, then that's going to hurt the balance of power, and that's going to cause the North to have a really big advantage in the House of Representatives and the Senate, and cause them to maybe to lose slavery, and they're going to want to protect slavery as best as they can. Another issue, after we get the territory in California, after we get all that Mexican land, is California itself. Gold was discovered there in 1849, and California is actually going to apply for statehood as a free state, which again is going to upset the balance of power between slave and free states. And the South is not going to want California to come as a free state. In fact, they think they should come in as a slave state, since California does have a big area that can be used for agriculture. But California is going to come in as a free state. That leads to another compromise. And this is actually a terrible compromise. No one likes this compromise. This is one of those compromises where it just doesn't, none of the sides actually like what was agreed upon. So there are a few big ideas that come out of the Compromise of 1850. California is going to be admitted as a free state. And then all that land that we got from Mexico from the Mexican War was going to be decided based on popular sovereignty. That is a key word, popular sovereignty. What that means is that we're going to vote in those territories if they are going to be slave or free. So as we add Kansas. Kansas is going to vote whether they're going to be slave or free. And the sale of slaves is then going to be prohibited in Washington, D.C. That's another term. And then there's going to be a new federal slave law to be enforced by the federal government called a Fugitive Slave Act. What that means is if an escaped slave was caught, then that escaped slave had to be returned. The effects of this compromise is really that no one likes it. No one really thinks it's a good idea. The South doesn't really like it. The North doesn't really like it. And so it's really just going to lead to more and more tension as we move forward. So that leads us into another area that leads to tension between the sides, and that's the abolition movement. Remember, the abolition movement is a movement trying to abolish slavery. Most Northerners are not abolitionists at the time. A lot of them are free soilers, meaning they want all that new territory to be free. They don't necessarily want it to be, they don't want the slaves to be free necessarily. They just want that territory to be free territory because they want an advantage in the House of Representatives and the Senate. The impact of this movement, though, even though it's not a large movement up north, it does cause the South to become more defensive about slavery and make them want to do more and more to protect slavery. One of the, we talked about some of the famous abolitionists before. Remember, Garrison wrote his Liberator. The South you couldn't even distribute the Liberator in the South. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, and that book was banned in the South. And then John Brown had his raid of Harper's Ferry, and that he tries to start a slave revolt, which is then going to freak the South out, the plantation owners out, that they think the Northern abolitionists are going to come down, try and start slave revolts, trying everything they can to get rid of slavery. So what ends up happening is the South does more and more to try to protect slavery. The actions of the abolitionists were significant, but it's ultimately over the controversy over the spread of slavery in the territories that led to secession and war, and in the end, abolition. So the abolition movement is important because it kind of pushes the South to want to protect those territories more and more and more, and make those territories slave territories so they won't lose slavery. That brings us to the idea of popular sovereignty and free soil. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act, I showed you on the map, Kansas-Nebraska is kind of right beside Missouri. What's going to happen is it's going to be used, popular sovereignty is going to be used. That means the people of Kansas are going to vote to determine if they're going to be slave or free. And this is a really interesting thing happens there is that Bleeding Kansas occurs, where pro-slavery people and anti-slavery people rush to Kansas to try to get there in time for the vote. And there's a lot of tension with both those sides being right there, and a lot of violence actually occurs. In fact, that guy John Brown that I just mentioned actually got famous there for some of the violent things that he did against pro-slavery people. It's basically the first act of the Civil War. It happens in Kansas, where they're fighting each other even before 1860, even before Abraham Lincoln's elected as president. Not long after that, the Republican Party is created. The Republican Party's main belief is that slavery should not be extended to the territories. That's what free soil means. It should not be extended to the territories. There are actually no Republican Party candidates on the ballot even in the South, and so whenever a Republican Party wins the presidency through Abraham Lincoln, that's going to lead to more and more tension between the South and the South getting upset and leaving. Another big instance that happens is Dred Scott. Dred Scott is a slave, and his master moved him from one territory to the other, and his master passed away. He actually sues. The decision, it goes up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court actually said that Dred Scott didn't have the right to sue because he was a slave and property doesn't have the right to sue. It also does away with all the compromises. It basically says that Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional, and so there's no more Missouri Compromise. And so now it's all going to be done by popular sovereignty, is the idea of going forward, which is going to lead to tension, as you saw in Kansas. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln ends up winning the election because the Democratic Party has two candidates, a northern guy and a southern guy, and with the Democratic Party being split with two candidates, that means that Abraham Lincoln is going to win, even though he's not even on the ballot in the South. He does say that he's not going to end slavery, but the South is worried that since he's about free soil, since he wants these new territories to be free and not slave, that what's going to happen is that there's going to be more senators and more House of Representatives members from free soil areas, which means that slavery could be abolished. And since the Senate would be unbalanced then, that's going to lead to the South not getting what they want in terms of tariffs and other political issues, and the big one being slavery. So what happens then is that the southern states meet together and they decide to succeed and leave the country. And that is what's going to lead to the Civil War. We'll talk about that in our next unit. Please go to Canvas to do the video quiz and turn in the notes guide. Make sure you put your name on it and make sure that name is in ink, and then ask one question. Remember, if you have any questions, feel free to ask me in class or send me a message. Thank you very much.